Let's make a start. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to, I guess this is the last colloquium of the quarter. This is our last teaching week, so I think this is the last one. It's really a great pleasure to have Horacio Espinosa as our speaker today. So I am not overlapping in area with Horacio, but I've been interacting with him in the US National Committee on Theoretical and Applied Mechanics, where he is the vice chair and will take over as chair in October, I think October or November of 2022. Horacio is the James and Nancy Farley Professor of Manufacturing and Entrepreneurship, the Professor of Mechanical Engineering, and the Director of the Theoretical and Applied Mechanics program in the McCormick School of Engineering at Northwestern University. We were just discussing that he received his PhD in solid mechanics from Brown University in 1992, and he's widely known for contributions in the area of deformation and failure of materials, design of micro and nano systems, in situ microscopy characterization of nanomaterials, and microfluidics for single cell manipulation and analysis. He told me to be short, but I'm going to comment that he's had very many awards for this work, including the Prager Medal from the Society of Engineering Society, and I can't say it, Engineering Science, 2 medals, the Murray and Sia Nemeth NASA medals from the Society of Experimental Mechanics, and the ASME Thurston Award. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering here and the foreign member of several other academies. Horacio, we're very grateful that you agreed to present via Zoom, and we will look forward to the opportunity to host you in person another time. So if you want to tee up your slides, I'll pass this over to you.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation, and it's really a pleasure to be here today. So let me share the slides. Are the slides fine?
Yes, you're good to go. Okay,
perfect. Thank you. So as I was saying, many friends at CALTECH, and many years of knowing people, collaborating in different capacities. So it's really a pleasure to be here. So today we'll talk about fracture of 2D materials and combining in situ experiments and atomistic modeling. And so just to motivate the reason for this type of studies, I'm sure you are very familiar with a lot of the progress and the interest in 2-dimensional materials, which is probably the most well-known is graphene, a monolayer of carbon atoms in 2 dimensions. But there are many others that are emerging, like transition metal dichalcogenides, mexenes, phosphorine, and so on. It's a very large list. And the interest from the community is in terms of synthesis, but primarily applications. And what you see here is the use in battery electrodes, flexible electronics, energy harvesting like in solar cells, bio and chemical sensors, and even nanocomposite for next generation armor. And the applications are many, as you can see here. So the interest is obviously to characterize this material from optical, electrical, and mechanical properties. And one of the weaknesses of the material is the stability and the strength and toughness. So that was an area that we were very interested in looking at the fundamental level. So what I will tell you today is some of the techniques that the community have used for experiments of fracture and failure of these materials in situ electron microscopy, some of the atomistic approaches, and primarily challenges associated with this type of studies. As you can imagine, just handling a monolayer or a tri-layer of atoms in specimens is extremely challenging aspect. So I divided my presentation in 2 parts, one on the in situ experiments, another on the atomistic modeling. And as I said, one of our motivations was to first understand these materials, but also to assess the predictive capabilities of atomistic models, because there is an interest in increasing the toughness of this material, and you can do that by defect engineering. But if we want to use the computer as a design tool, as you know that many groups are doing these days, we need to gain complete confidence in the predictive capability. So here I'm illustrating a little of the why we can do this research today, and it's the unprecedented progress in nanomechanical testing, as well as the imaging of this material with atomic resolution. This is due to aberration corrected transmission electron microscope that are more or less routine, although obviously you have to have a lot of expertise in conducting these experiments. The other thing I like to highlight is that the specimen characteristic dimension, for instance, if you think at the nanowire, the diameter is one of many common nanomaterials, but in the case of these 2D materials, the thickness, which is in the order of 1 nanometer, means that we are doing these experiments at smaller and smaller scales. And we can then take advantage of merging a modeling approach from quantum mechanics and molecular dynamics. And in the case of fracture, it's a little particular because you cannot use small domains, so you need many atoms. And that requires the use of molecular dynamic simulations, which people working in this area will recognize that capturing fracture and large deformations and bond dissociation is a challenging problem for these force fields or interatomic potentials that are typically used. So there are a number of challenges that you will see through my presentation. And let me start by sharing with you some of the heroic experiments as described by one friend at the National Lab. So if you try to do in situ transmission electron microscopy experiments of fracture, there are essentially two approaches that the community is following. The one on the left consists in depositing one of these flakes on a grid that has holes. The grid is basically a silicon nitride membrane. And so you can have electron beams in a transmission electron microscope like illustrated here with the location of the specimen here. And then in CCDs, get information about the atomic configurations. And the beam can be used to induce a crack and also propagate a crack, but also under certain conditions, you can visualize the atomic structures. So it's a convenient experimental setup, but it has a major drawback, which is that in this experiment, we are not measuring the loads and displacement like in a more controlled experiment. We are just having some sort of uncontrolled, but still we have a lot of information about the atomic structures at crack tips, and I will show you that. The other approach where you gain that control is using microelectromechanical systems that can apply loads and measure deformations with nanonewton resolution and nanometers displacement resolution. And in this particular scheme I will show you, what you see here is the instrument, and there is a holder, and at the end of the holder you have the MEMS system that does the measurement of load displacement, and a chip that is microfabricated in silicon where one would mount a sample. And I will tell you more details about this experiment, but one thing I would like to highlight here is that we are mounting a flake, this very flexible tri-layer of atoms in the case of molybdenum diselenide, for instance, and that's a very challenging process, as you can imagine. And so there are certain complications that still we are overcoming, I will share with you. So those are the two approaches. So let me start by sharing some details and information of what type of measurements you can do in this first approach, where you transfer the flake into a TM grid, and then by using the electron beam through radiation, there is an energy. Typically, the electron beam is operated at 200 kilo electron volts. The kinetic energy of the energy that carries the electron can produce vacancies. And if you increase the dose, you will induce a crack. So here is an example of a crack induced in the monolayer in the suspended specimen. But what is exciting is that these images are high magnification images at the crack tip, where we can see that the atomic positions are revealed under the right imaging conditions. And more than that, you can map the different atomic species. In this case, it's molybdenum diselenide. The blue is molybdenum. The selenide atoms are the red. And in this structure, you have that even when there are distortions, you can reveal very nicely at crack tips. So that's the information, but there is more than that that we can gain, which is the computation of the strain fields at the crack tip, and use that together with some constitutive law to compute the J integral. So what you see here is an image where the atomic configuration are revealed in the CCD camera for a certain magnification. And then using an algorithm that is called the structural template matching method, the idea is that you break in segments the image, and then you map to a template. And the template is an image of an undeformed lattice. So this, you can think at the template as the reference configuration in a continuum mechanics fashion, and the image, the actual image of the atoms in the deformed configuration, such that you can define a mapping and compute the deformation gradient everywhere in your domain. There are many details here, like the degree of defocusing and the magnification and the dose, the electron dose that is used to achieve very high resolution. But if you read this paper, you will find a lot of interesting studies in that respect. The key here is that you can fit Gaussian functions in each spot and get sub-pixel resolution, which brings to a good determination of the displacements. We are interested in fractures, so we would like to compute some measure of toughness. And typically, for nonlinear fracture mechanics, you could use the J integral. But for that, you need to know stresses, displacements, and strain energy density. So in the way we obtain that is, I told you how we compute the deformation gradient. From continuum mechanics, we can compute the green Lagrangian strain, and using density functional theory constitutive equation, we can obtain the Cauchy, the second polar Kirchhoff stress. And again, from continuum mechanics, the Cauchy stress or true stress. And in addition, the strain energies. So that gives us the methodology to perform this experiment that I mentioned, and then map what is the toughness that is observed in that experiment. This is showing that if you control the electron beam and the dose, you can propagate cracks. And so the idea is that you propagate the crack and you do an observation with limited dose to avoid any further propagation, because the interest is in having a stationary crack and map the fields with the methodology that I just explained, and then compute the toughness. And here are two instances, two experiments, where different crack lengths have been computed, and you see that the energy release rate, the J integral, is computed by an area, in this case, is quite close, and here is the error coming from fluctuations. So you see that the stresses that you obtain have fluctuations, as you would expect, and if you look in detail at the image, the degree of defocusing is not uniform. And this is because these are very flexible membranes, and thermal motion will introduce this oscillation and defocusing, and the degree of defocusing translates into the resolution in the displacement measurement. So that explains some of these, but you see very nicely stress concentrations at the crack tip, as you expect from asymptotic analysis and finite element analysis. And you can go beyond and say, okay, I use asymptotic analysis, it's become singular at the tip of the crack, and then the measurement can tell you what the Cauchy stress agrees with the asymptotic analysis and when it diverges, because it is obviously limited by the nonlinear behavior near the crack tip. And the length over which this inelastic region happens, according to these measurements, is in the order of 1.5 nanometers. So the material is quite brittle. The measurement that we did for molybdenum diselenide is represented here in an average over 3 cases. And if you compare with 2 times the surface energy, which it would be a Griffith type of criterion, you have that is on the same order. So brittle fracture is what we would expect also given the failure of these materials. And there is no R curve in this case. Here is another example. In the previous slide, I showed you molybdenum disulfide. This is molybdenum diselenide. It's another of those transition metal dichalcogenides. And there are many alloys that you can generate. But the message I would like to convey is that, again, we have quite a uniform and measurement of the energy for propagating the crack, and that the gain is very similar, in this case, even more similar to a Griffith type of criterion. So that was rewarding, but as I explained at the beginning, in this technique, we don't have control of the classical far field, low displacement type of problem. So we resorted to this other technique to achieve that control. And as I said, there is it's not shown here, but it's a MEMS transducer that will measure the force and the displacements. And in the way that this works is that there is this microfabricated silicon chip where you have a region of the chip that is connected by these folded beams to the fixed stationary part of the chip. So if you were to compress here, you will displace this part and then introduce a tension in a sample that is located across this gap. And this is the gap that we are seeing. And you can then measure the force and subtract the force that goes to the folded beams and obtain the force on the sample. So this is nice and it works very well, but the challenge here is how you transfer a flake of this 2D material onto this device. And there is where the complication comes and what makes this type of experiments quite challenging. The success rate of doing that successfully is very low, and we develop a technique that many people use in the community for making field effect transistors or other type of nano devices, which consist in starting with a substrate that is typically silicon with a layer of silicon oxide, and the monolayers that have been grown by chemical vapor deposition. So you have many of these flakes in different regions of the wafer, and you can then spin coat a polymer and then cut a region containing the flake. The flakes typically are tens of 5 to 10 microns, so this is doable. And then using a micropipette, deliver water and lift the polymer with the monolayer and then place on top of the silicon chip and dry it and remove the polymer. But the removing the polymer, there are different solvents that you can use, or you can use thermal annealing. What we found is that it's never perfect. It always leaves a very thin layer of polymer on top of the 2D material. And interestingly, and we studied this before on graphene oxide with polymers, this polymer has a nice toughening effect. And so what I will show you next is the measurement of the toughness of this material but now it's a composite, it's a laminated composite, if you wish, extremely thin, total thickness on the order of 2 nanometers with 1 nanometer the 2D material and then the polymer. So these are some of the measurements. Here is the region of the specimen, it has a certain width and height. We introduce a crack by radiation of the electron beam. And as you see, it's not as perfect as we would like, but you can generate a sharp crack. And then we take a movie, you will see this movie, and we measure load displacement. By analyzing the movie, we can find the position of the crack tip at different instances when these loads drop. And then, using fracture mechanics, compute the initiation toughness as 0 crack advance for the first measurement, and then the toughness as the crack progresses. And what you see is 2 things in this thing. One is that the pure monolayer, which we measure independently with the other technique, has a toughness that is represented here. And this toughness is in the order of 5 times larger, which is obviously the nice effect of the polymer with the polymer changes, bridging the wake of the crack and increasing the toughness. And when you have this type of nonlinear cohesive traction separation load, you have a crack length dependence and some saturation to a steady state. And this experiment didn't really reveal in full force the steady state regime. So we did some other experiments with crack lengths of different lengths. And then we completed the data to show that indeed the J delta A curve, in this case for this nanocomposite, extremely thin nanocomposite, has this nice behavior. It's not what we wanted. We wanted to have the pristine material, but it's extremely difficult to remove the polymer, and we try many different approaches. We are still investigating, but we took as a fact of life and some of the limitations and challenges that remain. We did another experiment that we thought it would be nice to look at what happens if you, since the MEMS devices have a lot of control in displacement and prescribed displacement, we could have a load this time that instead of being monotonic, it could be cyclic with the amplitude that we change from, let's say, far field 10 nanometer displacement, 30 nanometers, 50 nanometers, 7, but cycling with the hope that we could develop a sharper cracks, like a fatigue type of crack. But what we saw in reality was something very different, and I think you will find interesting. Initially, we were a little frustrated that it didn't work as we expected, but experiments never work as you expect. You find some interesting surprises. So I will run again this video, and I will show you essentially, look at this value here. As we cycle the load in time with different amplitude, you will see a lot of things happening at the crack tip. So what you see here is the crack tip. This time we don't see the atomic positions because the polymer was thicker in this sample, a little thicker in the order of 2 nanometers. And you don't see that, but you will see defects happening in the crack tip, like micro cracks, little holes. So I will run this movie again, and I let you to observe that, as you see, this is when the amplitude was 40 nanometers. This is when it was 50, so that you saw a little shift. And then when it's 60, and you see the crack opening and some of the morphology of the crack evolving. But the crack did not propagate, and according to our understanding from the previous experiment, it should have propagated for the maximum far field displacements that were imposed. So at the end of the experiment, we saw spontaneously this crack propagation at an angle and realized that the the geometry of the sample was more complex than our intended geometry, which is a strip with just one major crack that we will call the body crack. But due to the challenges in transfer and dealing with such a small samples and extremely thin, we had another crack here, an edge crack, that during the cycling, nothing happened here, but this crack probably was propagating. So we did some fracture mechanics with the idea to see if we could infer what was the toughness of the crack that propagated at the end of the experiment. And fracture mechanics is very good at doing this because we model the geometry with the edge crack, the body crack, and different scenarios with different edge crack length. Okay, so you can run multiple simulations and compute the J for the body crack with the propagation in the X direction, for the edge crack with the propagation in the X direction as well, and then at the end, a crack with the propagation like we saw at an angle. And here are the results. The body crack has a J in the X direction that, as you would expect, as the edge crack increases, this value, the applied J, goes down. Similarly, the edge crack, initially as the crack extends, increases, but then it starts going down and becomes the same as the major crack. But when you look at the inclined crack, you see at some point there is a crossover, meaning that the applied J of the inclined crack is larger than the J of the other two, and that's what we think was the geometry of the sample that triggered that propagation. And if you assume that that's the case, and you look at the maximum load, you predict what is the toughness for that inclined mixed mode crack. And as you see, it's in the order of what I showed you were the initiation toughness that we measure in the other experiment. So the whole thing came to close the loop, and all the results are consistent. They don't have the perfection that, you know, some of the larger scale micro or larger scale samples will have, but given all the conditions, I think that these measurements are very consistent and accurate. I would be interested in your opinions on this point. The other thing, now going to the second part of the talk. Remember that we did all this effort because we wanted to have data that we could compare to atomistic predictions of fracture. And this is a very important question when, you know, there are so much interest in using DFT and molecular dynamics and many atomistic methods to design materials. So this was like a case study to appreciate this. And when we started, my group doesn't develop force fields, but we encountered that if you go to the literature and you look for parameterized force fields for the material of interest, molybdenum diselenide, you get very weird results. So let me show two examples of what I mean by this. This is a DFT stress strain curve. I believe it was in the zigzag direction. And if you do the simulation with two force fields that you can find in the literature, one is Stirling-Weber in this reference, and another is a machine learning force field that was parameterized looking at the environment of the atoms. It's called a SNAP. This is what you see. So at large deformation, which is what's happening at the crack tip, you are very far off. And this is not surprising because these people were not studying fracture. They were studying thermal conductivity and many equilibrium, near equilibrium deformation. So a small deformation like lattice structure, elastic modulus, phonon dispersion. The other thing that happened is this was for molybdenum diselenide. For molybdenum disulfide, another material that there is a lot of interest in the community, we ran this fracture tests with a potential reported in the literature. And I will show you that this predicts this transition, which is not supported by DFT in this sense, that the transformation is these two sulfur atoms come close to each other. And those are the regions that you saw that initiated at the crack tip and propagated. But when you put this configuration in molecular dynamics with DFT force fields, so ab initio molecular dynamic, it's not stable. So it goes back to the original configurations. That tells you that this most likely is an artifact of the force field. So this left us with no other alternative than start looking at how to improve this force field, because in a fracture problem, you have many atoms, the size of the domain is important. So we started looking at what people typically do. And for parameterizing, the idea goes, you generate first principle ab initio data of a number of properties for that material. It could be from elastic constants to lattice structure, Fano dispersion, and so on. And then the exercise is finding the parameters in the functional forms of the force fields such that you can replicate the DFT data. And so most of the time, this becomes an optimization problem that people use genetic algorithms and local searches for the solution, but it's done in a sort of hierarchical way. So you start defining objectives of properties, like for instance, the equation of state, the stability at room temperature, the phonon dispersion curves. And first you make sure that you find through mutations and crossover that the error in the equation of state, for instance, is smaller than a certain value before you go and you look at the next property. So it's very difficult to draw any conclusions about how these different potentials that you could adopt will behave in this cascade of properties. Will the potential ever reproduce properties within a certain error? And if you improve on one property, will it improve on all the others? Well, that's not clear in this methodology. So we propose a different way that is, for us, it was inspired in many of the machine learning strategies and algorithms, which is, again, you obtain training and screening data sets with the density functional theory. But we did two major things here. One is because we're interested in fracture. Fracture happens with deformations and atomic environments that are far from equilibrium, far from minimization of the energy. And so we took equilibrium properties, but also non-equilibrium properties like bond dissociation, energy landscapes, large deformation stress strain curves, phase transitions. And so in addition, we define a subset of these properties for training, and another subset, both equilibrium and non-equilibrium, for screening. And here is something that you have to do as a designer of the parameterization, what properties you want to include, but this is not something that has to be static. You can start with some number and then evolve. And that was our intention, keep improving the force field for our objectives. Now, the scheme has three major components. The first one is training, which I will explain to you in more detail. So we are essentially looking for the constants in the force fields that best reproduce the DFT data. Then we do a screening for best candidates, and then we do a statistical evaluation, which is very helpful. So let me explain each one of these pillars. Well, I want to show you that we have a pillar with training, screening, and evaluation. So the training goes with the use of a multi-objective genetic algorithm of optimization. And we do the optimization by obviously having initial conditions and then evaluating with MD all the properties. And then we have a fitness defining this expression here. And the fitness is for each property. So the properties go from 1 to MT in this notation. So you have, let's say, a stress strain curve, dissociation, elastic constant, all those are properties. Can be single quantities like energies, for instance, cohesive energy, or could be an stress strain curve with many points. So we use this notation J here to run over all the points in the case of multi-point properties. And we take the difference between the predicted with MDE and the DFT property value, take the square with the weight, and we obtain many of these fitnesses. But the important thing here is not like in other optimization that you sum all the errors. Here we get for each property a fitness. So if you were to look at this in two properties, objective 1 and 2, because it's an optimization, we have solutions for any set of parameters that correspond to 1 point. And as you evolve with mutations and crossover the generations, you are evolving the front where the error tends to the utopia point, which is utopia because you never get there, 0 error in all the objectives. But the front is important because it tells you that there are many potential set of parameters that you could choose. And that's our first step. Training, running over 200 to 500 generations and finding this front that is, by the way, known as Pareto front. So people working in machine learning are very familiar with this idea. And that was one ingredient. The next, remember that we left some properties that we didn't use in the training, but that we want to screen for. And again, equilibrium and non-equilibrium properties. And we do the screening by looking at the prediction and then comparing to a fitness for any error that we allow to the DFT data. So let's say you want to get elastic constant within 20% error, you will put those weights here. And that allows you to select a subset of the points on the front that are the best candidates for you to use in computations. But the last step is very powerful, and you will gain an appreciation when I explain it. Now that we generated all these potential solutions, and we have many of them, because we run the code also with different initial random populations, so we get a number of points on the Pareto fronts, many solutions, many potential set of parameters. But then we do statistical analysis, and the correlation of the error, we construct the correlation metrics, where here are the list of all the properties. At the bottom, you have the same properties. So for instance, structure and cohesive energy is 1, and you will have a 1 correlation with the same property. So you will have the diagonal here is 1, and obviously symmetric. But any other coefficient will be either positive or negative between -1 and 1. If it's positive, it's great, because it means that if I improve one property, I will reduce the error of the other property where there is a positive correlation. So let's say you take here, it's not very strong, it's 0.2, but I would improve the elastic constant C12 and also the bond dissociation energy for the armchair. So you start gaining understanding of what are conflicting and in agreement properties, because these definitely are functional forms and reduced order models. So there is a limitation in what you can do. And this helps you to see, can I improve certain properties and improve both, or by improving one, I deteriorate another. The other is that you can refine the selection of the training properties, feedback that information and look for other candidates. You can augment the number of properties. And more importantly, you can assess the parameterization flexibility of different interatomic potentials. In theory, you will use the simplest potential to have more computational power and deal with larger problems or other things, but there is a cost associated to reducing the order of the approximation. So in our approach, two key things: we augment it to non-equilibrium properties. We do an explicit screening step, and the process is semi-automatic, and using machine learning can be automated even more. And our hope was to remove chemical intuition and domain expertise, because as you see, many of the groups working in this parameterization are people with a strong chemistry and physics background. And so you could think of democratization of force field parameterization as an objective here. So very briefly, because I will be running out of time otherwise, there are many different potentials that you can use. And there are pairwise potential, three-body cluster potential with two-body, three-body. The Stirling-Weber potential, for instance, is quite famous. It was developed many years ago for silicon when people were modeling semiconductors. And if you go into more, and one thing that you can see is the number of parameters. So a simple two-body interaction potential has 12 parameters. The Stirling-Weber, we have 31 parameters, is for covalent solids that are silicon. And one very famous potential is Tersov. And what Tersov realized is that the environment and the number of nearest neighbor affects the strength of the bonds between atoms. So he kept a simple, repulsive, and attractive type of formulation with functions, but he introduced this idea of bond order function, which is a function of a function which is given here, where this function brings information about the angular dependence, the coordination, and the different lengths between, for instance, when you are sitting at one atom and you look at your neighbor atoms, and you are dealing with the IK atom, the distance may be different. So this potential was very good and also developed for silicon, but this time it could explain many polymorphs, many different phases that the material was found experimentally, something that the Stirling-Weber potential, for instance, couldn't do despite the fact that it has a two-body and a three-body term. And then if you go into a little more complexity, similar functional forms, there is something called reactive bond order potential, 61 parameters, similar ideas, but the bond order functional is formulated a little differently. And that brings an interesting behavior of the potential in terms of reactivity. So let me show you briefly some of the results. Again, DFT data is your ground truth. You run for all these type of properties. Here is a summary again, and I will start showing you what is the behavior of the different potentials. So DFT data is in black through all these comparisons. So if you look at the elastic constants, the two potentials that we saw that were parameterized near the small deformation do very well because these are elastic constants, but they do extremely poor when you look at surface energy, for instance. Like SNAP, the machine learning, one of the machine learning potentials doesn't converge for surface energies. Then you can start looking at more nonlinear behavior by looking at vacancies, and you can start removing 2 selenium atoms, a cluster of vacancy molybdenum, 3 selenium, and so on, many different types. And what you see is, again, those potentials I showed earlier have a lot of problems, but Tersov, which is our parameterization, is have not perfect prediction, but more reasonable prediction. And the issue is that there is a trade-off, and that's what you are finding, what the potential can do. Dissociation, not surprisingly, we included in our screening, so the terso and the other potential we parameterize follow the dissociation energies as a function of the stretching, but very poor for the two potentials I showed you earlier. And more importantly, the stress strain curve, this is the DFT data. The terso is not perfect, but you can go with confidence to 20% deformations and even predict peak stress and the failure for the two directions, armchair and zigzag. And this is what I started with. The others were very poor. Even Buckingham, that is a very elementary potential, predicts good nonlinearities, but it gives some artificial transition, phase transition, because of obviously limitations of the potential. And I explained this idea that you have a competition between variables. So it's not something that you can say, okay, if I include more properties, I automatically will be able to recover them with computational accuracy. And I will show you how we use these metrics in the case of phonon dispersion. So the black is the DFT data, the three first acoustic modes, and then optical modes. These are frequency wave number. And the prediction of the terso that I just showed you for one mode, one acoustic mode that is the out of plane bending mode, is very far from the DFT data. And that translates into a very poor behavior of the thermal conductivity as a function of temperature when you compare with DFT data. And the question is then, can we use this methodology to improve the parameterization without degrading other properties? Because of course, you can always improve for selected properties. And this correlation metrics helps to understand one key concept here. If you improve the out of plane mode, which is very important in phonon propagation, is the ZA mode here, is strongly negatively correlated with, for instance, elastic constants and stability of the atomic structure at room temperature. But if you look at the next two modes, the in-plane modes, transverse and longitudinal, they are positively correlated. So one thing that you realize here is that you don't want to just put the mode that didn't fit well, but all three modes will give you a better performance. And indeed, we were able to match now thermal conductivity very well without degrading too much the other properties. The environment of the atoms is extremely broad and diverse. And so, for instance, if you take a selenium vacancy, so you remove one selenium, you have two seleniums, one molybdenum in this hexagonal lattice. So suppose you remove one selenium, as is illustrated here, on the top, and what you see here, this is the DFT. It's with periodicity, a small number of atoms, but it gives you this breaking of the bonds. And look at the final deformation there. What is the particular, sorry, deformed shape after dissociation? It remains horizontal. However, terso, after breaking, it gives you a tilt of this atom, as is shown here in this movie, and that is very problematic. If you look at the energetics in the initial metastable and final state, DFT tells you that the energies are increasing. So this is the most stable, and this is the least stable. But look at what the terso does. First it goes down, but then it goes up. So it tells you this is the most negative, the most stable, which is obviously wrong. So we corrected for this by using additional fitting of DFT data. And what the message that probably, without going into too many details, is that the force field is as good as the variable that you have included there with the trade-off I mentioned. So if you are particularly interested in other properties, you need to very carefully check and most likely include in the parameterization. That improvement that you see in the bond environment gave us much better prediction of the phase transition from the 2H to 1P, two phases in the material. You can see here. And the right energy of the phase is at the end of the transformation. And the energy barrier also well described. So many details that you want to use this calculation in a variety of scenarios. Transferability is a big thing because it means, properties that you didn't predict how well it does. And I can tell you that the different versions of the tensor that we parameterize behave quite well in capturing surfaces. And one thing that can be in the back of your mind is, how do I select the force field? What force field I use? Clearly, you can start with the most complex ones, reactive force field, but is it needed for your problem? By summing all the correlation coefficients and normalizing with the number of properties, we found that we can define a flexibility variable, which is the larger, means that more positively correlated properties. And thus, for instance, it's not surprising that tensor in this comparison is the best potential that you can obtain. But there are many caveats, as I showed you. Ribo is another potential that is more complex. Just to summarize, what we found is that there are certain conditions, like for instance, grain boundaries due to formation of vacancy, line vacancies, that tensor cannot predict a stable structure, but the parameterization of Ribo is able, which shows that in more complex scenarios of grain boundaries and so on, more complex force fields are needed and you can parameterize them. So let me go back to our fracture problem. We have the experimental data, now we have a parameterized force field with certain degree of confidence, and we want to assess the predictive capability. In other words, we want to compare the toughness predicted by the molecular dynamic simulations using the J integral concept, again, the area integral implemented in MD, versus the experimental measurement. And the conclusion is that the two come very close. We didn't fit any more the force field, we didn't do anything, and it predicts very reasonably the J integral. And not only that, but if we compare again the asymptotic, the experimental results are here, the MD results are here, and the agreement and the departure from the asymptotic is again around 1 nanometer. So all this gave us confidence that we have accomplished some progress in understanding experimentally and verifying force fields and finding ways of parameterize them such that we can answer a fundamental question. I started the presentation saying the Achilles heel of these new materials is that the stability and the toughness. So can we find ways, if you don't want polymers, to improve the toughness? And one way that you can see in the literature of graphene is using vacancies, using defects. There are a number of vacancies that you can form. You can, single vacancies, cluster of vacancies, line of vacancies. I will show you some results using the parameterized field. But before I do that, I want to show what are reasonable, experimentally reasonable densities of vacancies, density and types. So we did again dosage, electron dosage experiments and show that if you increase the dose rate, you will increase the number of single vacancies. And at some critical dose rate, you will start generating line vacancies. And I'm finishing. Thank you, Beverly, for the reminder. I know that I'm getting close to the outward. So this is just to say that we use densities that are experimentally sound. But then we went in silico and we look at random single vacancies, monoselenite vacancies, and we observe that, yeah, the crack propagates and can deflect, but there is no major toughening associated with it. More interestingly is when we have other vacancy clusters, there is, you see here, there is an arrest of the crack, shearing, and then propagation again. And for line vacancy is much more complex, the fracture process. There is an explanation for this when the crack arrested, why shear the lattice in this way. And again, you can do energy landscape to show that that's the most favorable way, and that for that environment, the crack deflection and so on. So everything can be explained in mechanics terms. But the key is that you don't gain a lot by, in this type of materials, some of these TMDCs, by putting the vacancy. At the most, you get something like 30–40% increase in toughness for certain defect types. So this is my last slide, and then I have the acknowledgements. So to conclude, I hope I persuaded you that we embark in this adventure of understanding fracture of these 2D materials. We came to the realization that some work was needed in determining the accuracy and of atomistic predictions, and the advance some of the strategies for doing the parameterization. And then there are future directions that I think there are many other defect types that people have looked or found in experiments that we could explore to toughen this material. But obviously, the materials are intrinsically very brittle, and some toughening mechanisms may be possible with defect engineering if polymers are not acceptable. To conclude, just let me mention that a number of collaborators, computational chemists primarily, also at Argonne National Lab, Jianguo Wen, that helped with the imaging. As you can imagine, this takes years of training and expertise. And some fantastic students, Zhu Zhang, that is soon graduating, also Huan Wen, both did a lot of the computational studies. Susan did the experiments, and then 2 new students that are continuing with this work. And of course, the funding agencies that supported this work. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Horacio. On behalf of the audience, a round of applause. We are right up on the top of the hour, so I know some people will have to go, but hopefully there are some questions from the audience. As usual, if you can raise your hand or type into chat, that would be good. I see we have one. Sergio has a question. Michael, can you maybe bring Sergio over? You can ask it in person. He's on the way. Any other questions, please either raise your hand or pop it into chat so that we can get that fitted in. Sergio, there you are, go ahead.
Sergio, you are muted. So
hello, Horacio. Yeah, my line isn't so great, so I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, I can hear you well.
But thank you for this talk. I mean, this stuff is just absolutely incredible. Going to the nanoscale in experimental work. I mean, I'm always amazed by your research, but I think you've gone even finer than I remembered, and so it's astonishing. Now, I have an initial question and then a couple of curiosity questions. The question is concerning your comment about the effect, or if you like, lack of effect of vacancies on toughness. You were kind of, as you were, disappointed. That's the way it sounded. But yeah, if I think about this structure, actually this lattice as a structure as opposed to a material, and sometimes we call this lattice a Kagome lattice. I don't know if that's quite right, because you actually have the hexagons rather than the triangles as well. But I mean, I'm thinking that this looks like a structure that is almost statically determinate. So there isn't a lot of scope, I think, for, if you like, tuning the local stress distribution, and hence I don't know that you can actually hope to achieve a lot with this particular scheme. But if you had like 2 layers or 3 layers instead of 1, then maybe the story would be different.
Right, right. Yeah, I agree.
Is that
The
observation, do you think?
The only interesting arrest, which is probably relating to toughness, is when we saw a certain environment of the defects that energetically favor shearing of the lattice, like a dislocation emanating. And people talk about dislocations in this material, but it's very different than metals. And you don't get, these emissions of defects because of the 2D nature, exactly what you are mentioning. When you stack multi-layers, the stacking is such that the interaction between layers is very weak. It's more van der Waals. So certainly it will introduce, especially if there is confinement or other features, and more interesting behavior may emerge.
But just to follow up, should I be thinking about breaking a single? I mean, okay, when we do experiments the old-fashioned way, i.e., the way I do them, I am by no means measuring the break of one bond. Mm-hmm. But what is your definition of crack? Is it was it that J integral, kind of that delta A variation of J? Is that the way you were defining the toughness?
Yeah, we define
it's still a macroscopic definition, is that right?
Yeah.
So to speak.
You go over an area contour around the crack. So you are computing essentially is the energy that is being delivered for propagation of the crack. The atomic processes are illustrated here. Could be the shearing of the lattice in this particular scenario with some vacancies in the neighborhood. Or it could be the cleavage, the sequential breaking of bonds, or it could be going down and then cleavage. And the reason why it does this in this scenario, because we use large elastic band, you take this initial configuration and then you shear, is that the lowest energy barrier is the shearing for this particular instance. Now, you may have many different instances depending on the arrangement of defects. But everything makes sense, and I think your observation that you think this as a lattice with the weakening, but some people found on graphene, in the case of graphene, some significant toughening. But we don't see that here, and most likely is because of the different chemical environment and properties. We still are investigating more complex scenarios of grain boundaries generated by line of vacancies, and that may be more promising. We don't know yet.
Thank you. I should let other people ask their questions, so I'll pause at this point.
Thank you for asking a question, Sergio. Actually, we have a comment in Q&A from George Popov. Maybe you can take a look at that, Horacio, while we just see if there's any last question. One coming in chat from Hussein, who says, thanks a lot for the talk. Can you please talk a little bit on whether functionalizing graphene can enhance toughness? If yes, what type of functionalizations are or should be pursued, and what are the underlying mechanisms? And I think we'll have to make this one the last question, so you can get off to your Friday evening, but you could offer Hussein some thoughts.
Yeah, sure. There were some studies that you look at a sharp crack in graphene, but then you have arrays of vacancies that form 5-7 defects, a type of defect. So imagine that introduces a warping of the lattice, and it's not functionalization, it's the presence of vacancies. We have studied graphene oxide, which it has functional groups, this oxygen, and show that polymers that bridging the crack, like I show in this case, could be very conducive to increasing the toughness. So it's a sort of polymer chains bridging the crack and then conferring toughness to the material. So there is where the functionalization could be, and the functionalization, of course, is in relation to how you get hydrogen bonds or other chemical bonds to have the polymer assembled on the 2D material.
Great, thank you. Hussein says thank you. Well, let me thank you on behalf of everyone. Really fascinating talk, and now I know what you do. I've been directly doing it on the committee level, but never been at a conference, overlapped in conference. So thank you, Horacio. We really appreciate it.
Thanks again for the opportunity to connect with all of you. Thank you.
And have a lovely Friday evening. I know it's late with you. So
okay, bye now.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.